Leave now. It's coming. You have been warned. Sarah could hear the news reporter on the television in the living room talking about the Hong Kong H1N5 virus. Deaths from the particularly virulent strain of flu had grown to over several hundred now, and the news anchor was advising people to wear masks and stay home if they showed signs of the illness. Sarah sighed. The television was something she tried not to be bothered by. Gina kept it on all day, even when she was gone from the bungalow. Sarah, on the other hand, had grown up with a television relegated to just a few hours of use a day. The idea of keeping it on constantly had been irritating at first, but now it simply served as background noise. It wasn't much different from the hum of cars from the freeway now. She stared at the ocean and sipped from the tall, slender coffee cup in her hands, wincing as the liquid scalded her tongue. The Santa Ana winds were warm, and she could smell the brine of the ocean, hear the gulls scream as they dove into the surf, hunting, she supposed, for their next meal. Gina Abernathy stretched out with a sigh on the chase lounge to Sarah's left. "My God, Sarah, you were up at the crack of dawn, just like your pops, God rest his soul." Her hair was already styled, stiff, with what had to be half a can of Aquanet holding it in place, and her fingers encrusted with several large, gaudy rings. Sarah smiled at her friend. Gina had been a long-time live-in girlfriend of Scotty Abernathy, Daddy's literary agent, and now his widow for the past 5 years. A month after Sarah's husband, Theo, had passed of pancreatic cancer, Gina had rousted Sarah out of her gray haze of grief, shoved her on a plane, and taken her to Fiji. That had been 2 years ago, and Gina had been a constant companion ever since. "I have to be at Cedars-Sinai by 10 to meet with Dr. Carlson, and you know traffic is far more difficult here than in Kansas City." "Oh, honey, you don't know the half of it. It takes an hour to go 20 miles. It's worse than New York, and that's saying a lot." Gina flapped her hands as she spoke, her East Coast accent creeping through. "I just don't know what you hope to do there, girl. You do know they're all crazy, right?" She turned and stared at Sarah, as if the thought had just occurred to her. Despite the early hour, Gina was made up, thick foundation caked on her face, blush, eyeliner, and mascara, the works. Gina Abernathy contributed to the livelihood of the cosmetics industry and single-handedly propped up several, by Sarah's estimation, something that was both awe-inspiring and slightly terrifying. Sarah's mother, June, had tolerated the younger woman's presence with patience, graciously including her whenever she invited Scotty to visit her and Dad while they had both been alive. She had known and been close friends with Lucinda, Scotty's first wife. Gina had been such a sharp departure from the mousy woman that Mom had once confided to Sarah that she couldn't imagine what Scotty had seen in Gina. Unless it is simply that he knew Lucinda could not and should not be replaced, and so he found her exact opposite. Gina would have been a pain in the ass, what with her clownish makeup, gaudy decor, and garish clothing, except that she was also one of the warmest, kindest human beings Sarah had ever met. She was the type who would do anything for a friend, especially in the aftermath of the worst possible loss. Theo's illness had not only taken them by surprise, but it had robbed them of any time to enjoy retirement or indulge in the bucket list of dreams they had slowly accumulated over the decades. They had fallen in love in college, and for Sarah, there had never been any other man she could imagine sharing her life with. Theo had matched her, intellectually, emotionally. Being with him, spending more than 30 years together, it had been a comfort. While many of her girlfriends from high school had gotten married at the same time as her, most had divorced at least once, and Sarah knew they had envied the close, steady relationship that she and Theo had shared. His abdominal pain, weight loss, and repeated bouts of nausea had all tied in so neatly to a particularly nasty round of flu that had been going around. Sarah's heart panged at the thought of 6 long weeks in which he had gotten progressively worse, until she had insisted on getting him into a doctor for tests. 2 weeks after that, they had learned the truth, And just 6 weeks later, Theo was gone. There had been no time to mount a defense, no time to try any alternative treatments or aggressive chemo. The man she had thought she would spend her golden years with was gone, and Sarah had descended into a miasma of grief and loneliness that no number of visits from friends and family could shake. That is, until Gina had come around and forced her back into the world again. She was lucky she had Gina, very lucky. Gina waved her jewel-bedecked fingers in Sarah's face. "Eartha Sarah! You still there, honey?" Sarah shook herself, tried to shake off the memories, to turn her focus to the present. "Sorry, Gina, I was miles away." "I'm just saying, girl, some of those people they have in there are crazy and violent." "Not the one I'm seeing today. She wouldn't harm a fly." Gina snorted. "That's what they say right before the patient tries to claw your eyes out. I just don't know why this was your choice of writing career. Honey, you could be a travel writer. My friend Blanche, she traveled to China, stayed in the finest hotels, saw the Great Wall, all on Condé Nast's dime. And her writing is shit compared to yours. With the genetics you got from your pops, you might as well have been born with a pen in your hand." Gina whistled. "But you decide to write an exposé on mental health care in America. Who the hell is going to read that, Sarah? Especially when it is going to be thicker than a textbook by the time you are done." She took a slurp of coffee and shook her head, the scent of Aquanet pouring off of her in a cloud. Sarah's nose twitched, and she fought off a sneeze. The older woman made her smile, something that seemed a rare thing now that Theo was gone. The only other things that made her happy were her rather grim writing subject and her 2 grandchildren, Chris and Jess. Sarah had spent 2 weeks visiting them during the summer, staying at their house in Belton, Missouri. They were teenagers now, which seemed impossible, because she distinctly remembered holding each of them in the hospital, exclaiming over their tiny little hands and wrinkled red faces. Michael and his wife Julie had raised them right, however, and despite being teenagers, they were as kind as ever. Every morning, Jess had brought 2 large mugs of tea, Earl Grey, with milk and sugar just the way Sarah liked it, down to the basement guest bedroom, and sat with her grandmother, planning what they could go and do that day. Chris had made it a point to introduce her to his friends, a unique combination of jocks and gangly nerds who were polite and said yes, ma'am, with regularity. One of them, Alan, who was slightly thicker around the middle, loved reading. He had spent hours talking with Sarah about their shared love of books. Good kids, all of them. Sarah sighed. Michael kept asking her if she would consider moving in. "We could even build a mother-in-law cottage in the back if you would prefer your privacy, Mom. I just wish you were closer. You'd get to see the kids more often." She hadn't been able to stay in the house she and Theo had shared for more than 35 years. It had felt so empty. Instead, she had rented it out, and after Gina had shoved her on a plane, ended up traveling for more than a year before settling down in the spare bedroom at Gina's, first in New York and later at her beach house in Southern California. A week's stay had turned into a month. Except for visiting Michael's family, she had found a sense of peace here in this small bungalow with a view of the Pacific Ocean. It was a sharp departure from the low, rolling hills of flyover country. Even the clouds in the sky were different. They were long and thin and wispy compared to the fat cumulonimbus in Missouri. Everything moved faster here. People, automobiles, the public transit, all frantic to get from one point to another. And it was here that she had gone back and re-examined the paperwork from her parents' files, the order to commit her father in 1954 that had been begun but never finalized, and the remaining mystery surrounding his death decades later. 15 years had passed since then, but the answers had never come. She thought about it now as she took another sip of coffee. The question of what happened to Dad, what had really happened to him, remained a mystery. What did near-death experiences and psychotic breaks do to people? Dad had always seemed fine. He'd just been Dad to her, but her sister Betty had often described Dad as being very different when she was young. Angry, indifferent, and resentful. That all changed after the accident, though, she had mused when Sarah pressed her. He took an interest in us, and that's also when he started writing, sold the company, and soon after that, you were born. She had shrugged. You know, they say that head injuries change people. Maybe it changed Dad for the better. Those words had haunted her. Had the accident truly affected Dad for the better? If so, he was one of the few. Head injuries like his, and she had examined the x-rays and spoken with numerous doctors on the subject, tended to change a person, but not for the better. And then there was his letter, one that spoke with certainty of this other life he was sure he had experienced, with Mom, Betty, and Danny dead, and he remarried to a nurse, Theo's mom no less, and a child born after, with her own name, Sarah Magdalene. That had been the other woman's name, Magdalene or Maggie, and it wasn't as if she could ask Maggie, for Maggie had died just 9 years after Mom and Dad's accident in 1962. Theo had been orphaned by it. His father had never been in the picture, and he had ended up being raised by relatives in a large, rambling brick farmhouse in Raymore, Missouri, just a few miles south of Kansas City, where she had grown up. Their shared geography had been the first connection when they met in college, something that brought them closer and given them something to talk about. It was mysterious, to say the least, but even now she struggled to find a realistic explanation, one that was grounded in facts, not fantasy. It was this quest that had led Sarah down a somewhat winding path to where it was now, a focus on mental health in America, and with it, the unique and odd interpretations of reality from the mentally ill's perspective. She had spoken to individuals who were involved in intense psychotherapy under the care of psychiatrists and therapists. She had spoken to several who were incarcerated in the penal system because the mental hospitals were now the last bastion for only the luckiest of the mentally ill. Today she was meeting with Dr. Carlson, who was treating a young woman who claimed to know the future. Dr. Carlson had reached out to Sarah after reading one of her articles, noted that she was writing a book, and asked if she was looking for more patients to interview. Their schedules had been full of conflicts for nearly 2 months, but now, today, she would finally get a chance to meet him and his patient for the first time. Gina's voice interrupted her thoughts. Sure you don't want to go shopping with me? I just got to stop by Prada and see their new handbag line. And besides, right around the corner is Jimmy Choo, and there is a young man there that is a ridiculous flirt. Gina laughed. The things he promises an old lady like me are, well, who knows? He might just jumpstart this dead-as-a-doornail libido of mine. You never know. Sarah suppressed a smile. Gina was loud, over the top, and full of chutzpah. She gave off an air of rich widow and had plenty of strapping, young, pretty-faced boys drooling after her wherever she went. Whether it was over her money or her still voluptuous body, Sarah couldn't say for sure, but Gina strung them along like puppets, never indulging, just teasing them and flirting outrageously. She had done it when Scotty was still alive, and he had pretended to be out of sorts over it, but really wasn't. Gina, despite appearances, hadn't wanted anyone but Scotty, even after Scotty, for that matter. It was obvious to Sarah that the older woman had loved her husband, body and soul. There was no one who could replace him. Maybe next week, Gina. I've been trying for over 2 months to get this appointment, and as a bonus, I'll get a read on the future. Who knows? Maybe she'll have some good stock tips, or tell me who is slated to win at the races. Gina was an avid horse racing fan and hadn't missed a race at the Kentucky Derby in over 10 years. Gina snorted, shook her head, and drained the last of her coffee. Sarah, honey, you are missing out. That fine, strapping lad is just the jolt to a woman's ego that every one of us 50-somethings need. Gina was in her mid-60s, but far be it from Sarah to correct her. But make sure and ask her if Black Shadow has a chance of winning. Best to hedge our bets after all. Gina had been hitting the horse races more often since one of her major investments had tanked. She still had enough money, and she was actually fairly good at judging winners, so recently her betting had been a boon instead of a bust. There were whispers in the wind that the American economy was not what it had been. Sarah had moved most of her portfolio into steady, low-interest-bearing bonds as the Dow alternately tanked and then exploded. The rapid seesawing made her nervous, and Michael had recently sent her a text again asking for her to come home to Missouri and stay with his family. "It's not looking good, Mom. I've been reading that we are heading for the mother of all depressions," he had written, "the likes of which will make the Great Depression look like a walk in the park in comparison." His concern was sweet, and she knew that his wife, Julie, was very involved in producing their own food and believed in self-sufficient living. She had turned their suburban yard outside of Kansas City into a food-producing paradise filled with fruit and nut trees and bushes, as well as raised beds that grew everything from asparagus to zucchini. Sarah loved walking through the raised beds and gathering herbs and fresh vegetables when she visited. It felt like a miniature Garden of Eden. Gina interrupted Sarah's thoughts again. "There's also shenanigans. Check on that one as well. I've got a good feeling about that horse." Sarah laughed, finished her coffee, and stood up. She leaned over and hugged her friend, holding her breath so she didn't pass out from the hairspray fumes still off-gassing and polluting the air. It was enough to give Sarah a thumping headache if she took a big enough whiff. She couldn't understand how Gina managed to stop herself from passing out. "I'll catch lunch out, but let's make plans for dinner, okay?" Gina gave her a fierce squeeze back. "I'll make some cannoli." "Sounds wonderful." Sarah had put on 5 pounds since she had moved into Gina's guest room. Her friend's cooking remained out of this world, and she specialized in delectable, albeit fattening, Italian cuisine. The drive into the city was hair-raising and frantic for the first 20 minutes, and then slowed to a maddening stop and go as Sarah encountered 2 different fender benders. She was relieved she had left an hour earlier than planned because she had a long hike to the entrance of the hospital. All the nearby parking lots were full, and she had to park several hundred yards away. The last 15 minutes before her appointment with Dr. Carlson were eaten up by going through security, a necessary precaution for the locked psychiatric unit she would be walking through. At just 2 minutes to 10, she sat down in a hard plastic chair to wait for Dr. Carlson to respond to the page announcing she was here. She didn't have long to wait. He strode over to her and shook her hand. "Mrs. Aronson, it's a pleasure. Please, let's meet in my office." His office was small and held a desk, filing cabinet, and 2 chairs. She looked around it and realized that he must see patients elsewhere. Papers were in haphazard heaps here, there, and everywhere. Pictures of his family were half buried by them, showing only tantalizing glimpses of a trio of tow-headed children laughing in a park. "Thank you for taking the time to see me, Dr. Carlson." He nodded. "I found your article on the high percentage of incarcerated mentally ill to be rather fascinating, Mrs. Aronson. Truly, the pleasure is all mine." The psychiatrist was slim, with a receding hairline and thick Coke bottle spectacles. He wore a rather plain plaid shirt and khaki-colored pants. She had caught him sucking in his gut and smothered a smile. Even after all these years, her own frame was slim, her hair only now beginning to show white and gray hairs, intermingled with the blonde. She still noticed men turning their heads when she passed. It was a lovely feeling, one that she appreciated but felt no desire to act upon. Theo had been the love of her life, but that part of her life, the one that hoped for a partner to walk through the world with, that was gone, buried with Theo. "Can I get you anything? Coffee, tea, water?" he asked. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Now that she was here, Sarah was eager to meet the patient Dr. Carlson had spoken about in his email. "Well then." He settled into his seat and reached for a rather thin folder. "I don't have as much detail as we normally would have at this stage. Usually, by the time someone is committed, the medical history is quite complicated, and there are multiple incidents. In Sybil's case, however." Sarah blinked. Her name is Sybil? As in Sybil Dorset? Sybil Dorset had been a pseudonym for a woman plagued with multiple personality disorder. At the time the book had come out in the early 1970s, it had led to a movie starring Sally Field as Sybil. No, her name has a different spelling. Sybil Zradchi is her full name." He pronounced it Zradchi as he pushed the thin file folder towards Sarah.
She was found on Rodeo Drive, screaming at the top of her lungs that her child is missing and that there was no time, that everyone needed to leave now.
He shook his head.
She alternated between telling anyone who would listen that the collapse was coming, whatever that is, and that her baby is gone, that she had been taken by someone.
So, she hadn't done anything illegal, and she wasn't placed in custody? Sarah asked, her eyes focused on the photograph of a disheveled, raven-haired woman with piercing green eyes staring up at her.
Initially, yes, because she ran out into traffic, screaming that her child was in the road, in a car seat no less, swore up and down she could see her in the road.
But there was no child.
No.
He tapped the report attached to the other side.
No drugs in her system, and an examination here at Sinai determined she had given birth recently. But we have no records of a child's birth, no records of a Sybil Zradji, for that matter, and no fingerprints in the system. Sybil Zradji had no identification, could tell us nothing about where she had grown up, where she had lived. Hell, it was as if she had appeared, freshly made, with no history, family, or records.
Sarah stared at the file, and then back at Dr. Carlson. That's
impossible,
he smiled then, and she was struck by a sense of longing. It reminded her of Theo's smile in some strange way.
Tell me about it.
His smile disappeared, replaced by a more hopeful look.
That's why I contacted you. I was hoping that perhaps you could write about her, and that we could find her family. Perhaps this child is in danger. We could find them and see if they could help provide the background that we need to shake her out of this muddled state. She's calmed down, somewhat, but I think that if we just find out more about her, I could create a more effective treatment plan.
Sarah nodded, finally understanding why he had contacted her. His voice said it all. He gave a damn, and that was rare. She looked again at the photos on his desk, and he followed her glance, reaching out with his left hand to fish the photo out of the tall stack of papers and hand it to her. It showed him surrounded by 2 boys and a girl, all tow-headed to his dark brown hair. The children were obviously related to each other, but they looked nothing like him.
Roger, Amelia, and Landon, he said. I guess you could say I inherited them. My stepsister and her husband died 4 years ago, auto accident, and our parents were too old to take on 3 kids.
He smiled wryly.
In a way, the kids are the best thing that ever happened to me.
His grin faded.
Sybil has had a child within the last few months. The doctor who examined her was sure of it. And maybe that baby is in danger, somewhere out there.
He looked back at the photograph.
There are all kinds of hair-raising stories I hear in this line of work. Abuse, neglect, drugs, even human trafficking. The situations some of my patients have endured, the worst possible of childhood and even adult trauma.
He stared at the photo, his eyes betraying his devotion to the children.
I just want to make sure Sybil's baby is safe. I spoke with one of the psychologists on staff at New Jersey State Prison, and he told me that you got more information out of Charles Cullen than he had in 5 years of therapy.
Sarah smiled and shook her head. I got lucky. Dr. Carlson leaned back in his chair.
No, I think it's your demeanor, the way you carry yourself, the sound of your voice, everything. Heck, I never talk about my kids. If I do, I just say they're my sister's kids and leave it at that. You've got something, Mrs. Aronson, a gift, if you will, and that's why I contacted you. I could see it in your articles, the way you have managed to interact with the people you write about. They trust you. I wanted to see if you would be able to get some details out of Sybil, something, anything, that would help us track down that baby.
He set the picture down on his desk, gently moving the stacks of papers away from the frame, giving it a few inches of space in each direction, and stared at the photo again before turning his attention to Sarah.
The police terrify her. She clams up and won't say a word, and with me, she cries. When she isn't crying, she is telling me of stories of another world, one filled with magic, that hovers in another dimension in the same space as Earth. She says it fits over Earth, like the skin of an onion, and she insists she needs to return to that world soon, before the coming collapse. Perhaps she will talk to you, give you some details you can share with us. If not, he glanced back at the photo of his children, then I fear for that baby.
Half an hour later, Sarah found herself face to face with a frail version of the disheveled woman in the photograph. According to Dr. Carlson, Sybil had been in their locked ward for nearly 10 weeks. From the look of it, She had lost weight, a lot of it, in a rather short amount of time. Her raven hair was limp and stringy. Her green eyes were lackluster and half-closed. She didn't acknowledge Sarah as they sat her down in the chair on the opposite side of the table. The door shut quietly behind the two orderlies who had escorted Sybil Thradshee into the room. But Sarah knew they were right outside in the hall, in case anything went wrong during the interview. "Good morning, Sybil. My name is Sarah." Sybil blinked slowly, and then raised her head and stared at Sarah without speaking. Sarah began with her standard introduction. "I'm not with the police. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a journalist, and if you would like to share it, I would very much like to hear your story." "My story?" The woman stared at her. Her eyes held dark shadows under them, and her skin sallow, tinged with a hint of gray. She looked haunted, and Sarah couldn't help wondering if perhaps this woman had killed her baby. It wouldn't be the first time she had spoken with a woman who had. "Yes, your story, or whatever you want to share with me. I'm a journalist," Sarah repeated. "My job is to listen to people." Sybil gave a strange sound, dry, like the leaves in winter, and Sarah realized the woman was laughing. "No one listens. I tell them what I see, and they never listen." "I will." Sarah watched as Sybil looked at her then, the disheveled woman's strong psyche pushing through the haze of sedatives and antipsychotics the staff had been feeding her, and sneered. "You might listen, but you can't understand. You can never understand. And I see your death, along with others, so many others. You will be the first of many, so many." Sarah felt a small chill crawl down her neck at Sybil's words. It lasted but a moment. She was far less afraid of death with Theo gone. It wasn't that she wanted to die, quite the opposite, but seeing it happen had changed the way she thought of life. She persisted. "Tell it to me anyway." Sybil's lips trembled, and Sarah could see her wrestling with a decision. "You're a journalist, yes?" "Yes." "You will write down what I say?" "Yes." Sarah fumbled to open the recording function on her cell phone. "I record the conversations. That way I don't misremember any details. Would that be okay?" Sybil twitched, then twitched again, more obvious this time, and Sarah realized the woman was nodding. She pressed the button. "It's recording now." Sybil sat for a moment, unmoving and silent, before she said softly, "They think I'm confused, that I'm showing signs of postpartum psychosis. They think I killed my child." Sarah pushed the phone closer towards Sybil, hoping that it was able to pick up her words. Sybil, in turn, leaned towards it. "I didn't kill her. Natalia is alive and well. I've seen it. I know she is safe, but she doesn't belong there, and neither do I." "Here at the hospital?" Sarah asked. "No, here in this world," Sybil replied, an edge creeping into her voice. Sarah nodded. The key to dealing with the mentally ill was to affirm what they said and to provide a listening ear. "Where would you go with Natalia, if not here in this world?" "To Fürstenheim," Sybil replied, a dreamy look on her face, "where my people come from." "Tell me more about your people and Fürstenheim," Sybil said, her eyes sharp on Sarah's. "It means first world. It is where I and the rest of my people come from." Sarah kept her face serene. "Another world? Is it in a different solar system?" Sybil glared. "You mock me." She pulled back and let her dark, stringy hair fall across her face. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she was reminded of that awful horror movie, The Ring. She had happened across it when she had been laid up with a broken ankle several years ago, long before Theo had died. She had watched the entire movie, pillows clutched in her lap. It had given her nightmares. "I'm sorry, Sybil. I did not mean for you to feel disbelieved or mocked. Sarah kept her voice steady and calm, but Sybil turned away from her, averting her gaze. Sybil, I am very sorry. Please, will you tell me if Natalia is on Fiersteheim? The memory of Dr. Carlson's face, his earnest concern for this missing baby, it filled Sarah's heart with fear as well. The baby was innocent, and if she could just get Sybil to speak, they had a chance of finding it. No, her alive. A tear slid down Sybil's nose. You don't believe me. No one does. Her voice was even quieter now. A cracked whisper as she fought emotion, struggled to stop the tears that had followed the first. They dripped off of her chin, a splat of liquid on the battered formica table. I wish I knew where Natalia was, she said, her voice rising ever so slightly. I know. She isn't in Fiersteheim. None of the Necheras know of her. I didn't tell them. The arbre genealogique controls who breeds and when. Natalia, she wasn't planned by them. It was chance encounter. She turned, her eyes agonized, desperate. If he hadn't died, I would have told them. Perhaps it would have been excused. But most have moved beyond the world walls. She hiccuped, the tears falling faster. I was supposed to go through them too. I was told to travel to the East Coast, to board a private plane that had been chartered, to join the others heading for a thin spot in Germany. But on the way to meet the others, I had a vision. Sybil wiped her tears away, a trail of tears and snot combining into a stringy mess. She wiped again, smearing her hospital-issued sweatshirt with a glob of sticky goo. Sarah swallowed hard, doing her best to ignore her queasy stomach and not react. The woman was talking, and that was a big step. Tell me what happens when you have a vision, Sybil. The younger woman shook her head. It hurts. A lot. I black out. When I came to, I was in a hospital. They thought I'd been mugged. She stopped, stared off into space, staring with a confused look at the opposite wall. Sarah sighed to herself. Inside of locked wards like this one, the use of sedatives and antipsychotics was liberal and often heavy-handed. Communicating with Sybil was going to be difficult if they kept her dosage at this high level. But instead, you had a vision, is that right? Yes, Sybil answered, but did not elaborate, once again her concentration slipping away. What was in your vision, Sybil? Sybil's eyes blinked and refocused on Sarah. You said you had a vision on your way to meet the others. What was your vision about? A train bombing in New York. A train bombing? Not the Twin Towers? No. It was underground. Fire. Explosion. And the blood. Sybil stared past Sarah's shoulder, a 1,000-yard stare that did not see what was in this room, but somewhere far away instead. What happened then, Sybil? At the sound of her name, her head swiveled back towards Sarah, and Sybil stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. When you woke up in the hospital, and they thought you had been mugged, what happened then? Sarah prodded gently. Sybil smiled. I knew better than to say anything. Humans never listen. They can't imagine a world where there is no science, only magic. If you say that you can see the future, then obviously you are mad. I said nothing, only that I couldn't remember what happened, and they let me go. Were you pregnant then? Sarah asked, hoping to establish a timeline and possibly pinpoint Sybil's hospital stay for Dr. Carlson to follow up. No, Sybil said, shaking her head. Okay. Would you like to tell me what happened next? He found me. Who found you, Sybil? Why, Connor, of course. Sybil gave her a sideways look, as if Sarah should have known the answer. Does Connor have a last name? Is he Natalia's father? The tears welled up in Sybil's eyes. Yes. But when she quickened in me, he told me I wasn't her. I wasn't Maggie. He said that I meant nothing to him, that no one existed but Maggie and his son Theo. The small chill Sarah had felt at the beginning of the conversation returned when Sybil spoke Theo's name out loud. And at that moment, Sybil nodded, her green eyes intense. She held up a thin, bony finger. The fingernail had been chewed to the quick. You know now. Brother in one timeline, husband in the other. As if fate couldn't keep you apart. Fate's highway, it has many twists and turns. She smiled then, her teeth yellowed and stained, madness rising in her eyes. Your father knew it. The moment you took Theo home to meet your family, to tell them of your future child. She leaned forward, her eyes sparking with interest. Your father told you about it, didn't he? He did. I just know it. I can see it in your eyes. Sarah stood up, her chair knocking back and falling to the floor. She pressed the stop button on her recording app. Sybil, The chill hadn't left her. If anything, it had grown. Who was this woman? Who was she really? I need to take a bathroom break, if you don't mind, she said. The words came fast, spitting out as she backpedaled, phone in hand, towards the door, knocking on it briskly. An orderly opened it, and she slid through, suddenly out of breath, as her heart raced and stuttered. The burly man, dressed in the standard blue scrubs that all of the workers there wore, coughed wetly, and she could feel and see the fever racing through him. He asked, Are you done speaking to the patient, ma'am? Before she could answer, Dr. Carlson entered the hallway, walking briskly out of the observation room. Mrs. Aronson, are you feeling all right? You looked as if you'd seen a ghost. Sarah plastered a smile on her face. I'm fine, Dr. Carlson, just surprised. If I may ask, what did you share with Sybil about me prior to my meeting her? His concerned expression faded slightly, replaced by a confused frown. Nothing, really. Just that a female journalist wanted to speak with her. I didn't follow that last bit. Something about brother and husband and... His voice petered out as Sarah backed away. I'm sorry, She looked around. I need to visit the ladies' room, if you don't mind. Oh, certainly. It's just down the hall, through the security doors. I'll have him buzz you through. She nodded her thanks and walked briskly towards the doors, hearing the tinny buzz as she strode over to them and pushed her way through. She found the restrooms on the left and slipped inside, her heart hammering. How had Sybil known? About Theo. About Theo's mother, Maggie. Maggie had died in a car accident when Theo was barely 12 years old. Her loss had left him orphaned. His father... My God, she just told me that her child and my Theo had the same father. But it was impossible. It had to be impossible. A gap of, 60 years between the two siblings? Sarah felt lightheaded, as if she had entered this alien world Sybil had spoken of, this Verstaheim. She called it First World. But referring to the letter, something only she and Theo had read, no one else, not even Betty, God rest her soul. Her older sister had gone to her grave, never having read that letter that Dad had left Sarah. In the end, after reading it and rereading it, Sarah couldn't make sense of it. It had frightened her in many ways, as if this other world had reached out and taken some of her family with it. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, clutching the sink, her knuckles white, her reflection pale, in the cheap fluorescent light that flickered from the ceiling above. Of all the parts of the letter from her father that she had read and reread until the words were memorized, Sybil's comments brought one back with full force.
Of all the emotions or fears this letter might stir in you, reading that Theo is, in my memories, both your brother and your husband might be disturbing to you. Believe me, it took me by surprise, and yet it also made absolute sense. It felt as if the world was put right again, in some way, by Theo's return to our lives. Perhaps your souls sought each other out, reuniting that which had been lost. Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one, Sarah whispered as she stared into the mirror. So what? Magic and time travel in other worlds really do exist? Sarah Magdalene Edmonds Aronson, do you realize how insane that sounds? A knock sounded at the door.
Mrs. Aronson, is everything all right in there?
Dr. Carlson's voice was muffled, yet his concern carried through the thick metal door. She looked down at her hands. Her wedding band was set firmly on the right hand, a clear sign of widowhood. Her hands showed her age more than her face, which had only a handful of wrinkles to betray the fact that she was edging out of her 50s and would soon celebrate 6 decades on Earth. Or would she? Sybil had said, "I see your death, along with others, so many others."
Mrs. Aronson?
Mrs. Aronson? The muffled murmur of a second voice, a woman, possibly one of the unit nurses, joined Dr. Carlson's. It was followed by a brisk knock at the door. Sarah stared at her hands for a second longer, reached into the stall to flush the toilet, and called out loudly, "Just a minute." She ran the water, splashed it on her hands, and dried them, her ring catching and tearing the paper towel. She marched out the door, a professional smile on her face. "My apologies, Dr. Carlson. My friend took me out to a new Thai restaurant last night, and I think it must have upset my stomach. Let's get back to it, shall we?" She ignored the curious stare of the young unit nurse standing beside the doctor. His face was full of concern and a flash of confusion.
Oh, I thought perhaps Sybil had said something that bothered you. Are you sure you are feeling well enough to continue?
"I'm fine, really. Just a bit of stomach upset at the worst possible time." She smiled wider, perhaps too brightly, because Dr. Carlson cocked his head and looked as if he were about to object. A commotion from beyond the locked doors distracted him, however. One orderly shouted for help. Another ran from the nearby nurses' station towards the room where Sarah had spoken with Sybil. Dr. Carlson turned and hustled down the corridor, Sarah on his heels as he used his keycard to buzz through the doors, his legs moving in a fast trot that Sarah was challenged to keep up with. At the doorway, her way was blocked by Dr. Carlson and another duty nurse, but she could see inside it quite clearly. Sybil had fallen from her chair, her body locked in what appeared to be a grand mal seizure. Her back arched impossibly far, and her hands and legs contorted into impossible angles. The carotid artery bulged out of her neck, and she seemed to be drooling and choking at the same time. It was her eyes that Sarah couldn't stop staring at. The vivid green eyes that had locked onto hers just moments before were black, and not just the iris, but the entire sclera, which was normally white, with the odd blood vessel twisting through. All the eye was black. Sarah wasn't the only one who noticed. The duty nurse on the floor stood next to her. She gave a small gasp and muttered, "Her eyes? My God, what in the world?" Sybil's slight body shook violently, and Sarah winced at the sharp crack of the woman's head on the floor. Dr. Carlson pulled his white lab coat off and handed it to the orderly, who shoved it under Sybil's head as her spine arched again, impossibly high, rigid, and her head lifted off the ground, only to slam back down again. Dr. Carlson shoved the table and chairs out of the way and knelt beside his patient, his hand light on her wrist. He spared a cursory glance in Sarah's direction and spoke softly to the orderly, holding Sybil's head, cushioning her skull with his hand and lab coat as he looked up at Sarah.
"Mrs. Aronson, my apologies, but it looks as if we are done for the day. It will take a few hours for Sybil to recover from her seizure. If you could return tomorrow at the same time, I would be happy to arrange access to her again at that time."
Yes, of course, Sarah responded, backing away from the doorway. In truth, she was taken aback by the ferocity of the woman's seizure. In high school, she had once witnessed a friend of hers having an epileptic seizure. It had been terrifying for her. This one, however, had been far more violent, and it was still happening. Her spine arched repeatedly, her limbs shook, and her head slammed up and down against the orderly's hand and Dr. Carlson's folded-up lab coat. Sarah turned, the duty nurse still by her side, and walked down the hall, her mind spinning. "Those eyes," the duty nurse murmured. "I've never seen anything like it before." Sarah said nothing until they arrived at the locked doors. The other woman produced a keycard and seconds later escorted Sarah through them, down the hall to the elevators. They slowed to a stop, and the woman sneezed violently twice. "Ugh, sorry. I've been fighting the flu bug all week." "I hope you feel better soon, and that it isn't that Hong Kong variant that is going around," Sarah said. "Me too. My nephew's family were filled with it last week. It was touch and go with their 2-year-old for a few days there." The woman produced a worn Kleenex from her pocket and blew her nose into it. "Oh, goodness. I hope everything has turned out for the best." "It did. Tommy is back to running his parents ragged. Damned if they don't recover fast." "Well, thank you, Ellen," Sarah said, noting the name tag on the woman's uniform. "I know the way from here." The woman nodded, flapped her hand at Sarah before she turned and began walking back the way she came. Sarah pushed the down button at the elevator, her mind occupied with Sybil. She kept replaying the words over and over, returning to the woman's claims, the people she shouldn't even know about, even the train bombing, the one in New York she mentioned. Try as she might, Sarah couldn't remember hearing of any train bombing. She clung to this fact, desperate to cast any kind of doubt on the woman's words, because if she didn't, well... The long drive home flew by as Sarah reviewed and reviewed again Sybil's words, her mannerisms and reactions. She drove in the slow lane, knowing it was the safest option for her since she was used to the less frenetic Midwestern drivers. Despite maintaining the speed limit, other cars passed her on the left, honking in frustration. She ignored them as she listened to the conversation play from the voice recorder.